With everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Crypto-anarchy, Philosophies of Cryptography and Decentralization. Um, the rise of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology of the last few years has largely unfolded without a properly philosophical and historical critique, giving shape to new forms of political and economic organization, from libertarian network states to emerging models of digital governance and surveillance. Existing analysis from the left has often taken the forms of wholesale rejection, while the right has supported these technologies in pursuit of various models of decentralization and private control. It's clear that a new orientation to technology is needed for human emancipation, one that can build upon the legacy of left accelerationism as well as other philosophical approaches to technology. A kernel of this orientation can be found in the words of Hal Finney, who received the first Bitcoin transaction from the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto, when he stated that the computer can be used as a tool to liberate and protect people rather to control them. It is into the spirit that we will revisit key tests of the relatively unknown crypto-anarchist canon to understand the liberatory and reactionary possibilities in the latent philosophy of cryptocurrency. We should recognize that cryptocurrency and a broad hierarchy spirit, crypto-libertarianism, are currently manifesting themselves in the formation of network states like Prospera, free from government regulation, as well as new debates about technology and political power. Despite these developments, we will begin by trying to understand cryptocurrency as an outgrown of anarchist critiques of the state, the fusion of cryptography and anarchism by the crypto-anarchist, and the move by cyberpunks to translate legal questions into technical ones in order to defend people from corporate and state overreach, and to establish new forms of individual sovereignty. It is this historical tradition that has led to the formation of WikiLeaks, Bitcoin, Ethereum, decentralized autonomous organization, and the broader ecosystem of network states. Um, Harry Halpin is a computer science known for his work in cryptography and privacy enhancing technologies. He co-founded Nin Technologies, which is building a decentralized mixed net to combat mass surveillance. He also played a key role in standard the W3C web cryptography API across browsers. He researched on the philosophy of cryptography, the limits of abstraction and security, and building more robust and private systems. You can start, Harry.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for the introduction. So this is our course, The Coming Crypto-Anarchy, not just anarchy as it was, but crypto-anarchy. So the combination of cryptography and anarchism, particularly looking at decentralization. So we're going to have four courses. Today's the first. And if you want to get in touch with me, I have two emails. I haven't quite figured out how to, so just the NimTech email, which is my work email, is a bit quicker on the response, but I will check them both. So, what are we doing here? We're really trying to understand historically and philosophically cryptography, decentralization, and cryptocurrency. And these are, despite all the hype on AI, still very powerful forces. If you live in the Middle East, obviously the rise of the United Arab Emirates and Dubai has been fueled by, to a large extent, cryptocurrency. We're seeing nation states such as, Russia and Iran use it to evade sanctions. People using it to evade sanctions. I was just in Mauritania a few months ago. More or less one functional bank in the whole country. Everything else is running over a Singapore stablecoin banking app. And if you're in the United States, you may have noticed that cryptocurrency proponents have joined into the Trump administration. And we have, of course, acts like the Genius Act, which promotes US dollar-based stable coins, and also soon a market clarity or structuring act to talk about the difference between kinds of various cryptocurrencies. So we're seeing just all over the place something which I didn't really expect when I got involved in the space, probably back in like 2015. Um, I really didn't expect to see this much public adoption of cryptocurrency. It seemed to be at the time a very fringe hacker thing to do. So I'll tell my personal stories about it in the class, but I just want to give a little bit of a philosophical background as well, since that was my kind of technical background. So my just so people know, if you're interested, I've done a lot of stuff before cryptocurrency. I worked on particularly the extended mine thesis. So my PhD advisor was a guy called Andy Clark, who's famous for co-inventing the thesis with Dave Chalmers. And I finished my PhD there under him at University of Edinburgh. Then I did my postdoctoral studies in philosophy with Bernard Stiegler, the Centre Pompidou, Erie de Centre Pompidou. I my background is in computer science, but I have been studying philosophy since I don't know since I've started. And most of my PhD advisors have also I tend to have a dual philosophy computer science background. So in terms of like Marx and Hegel, I worked at Duke for a while and studied them under Fred Jameson. So I do kind of view historical materialism as a useful way of understanding history. I don't particularly view Marxism as just so people know as a way of shaping the future. And the reason why I do so is because some of the critiques here I think are currently unsolved. But the critiques are unsolved by the broader Marxist tradition. So this is the critiques of, for example, libertarianism, Hayek, von Mises, the socialist calculation problem is not yet solved. So we'll go into that. But I am sympathetic to a large amount of progressive traditions. I think we probably will need a new one to get through this coming kind of global crisis. And I'm pretty familiar with the global crisis insofar as that I taught cryptocurrency at the American University of Beirut during their hyperinflation crisis. So I taught business students and computer programmers and all sorts of people just how to use cryptocurrency and how because everyone's currency, everyone's savings disappeared during that hyperinflation crisis. And of course, the Bitcoiners think such a hyperinflationary crisis is going to come to Europe and come to the United States eventually. And yeah, so I'm very interested in this topic. I've given a few talks on it. This is the first time I kind of get enough time and space to go into it. I will share some videos for those talks in the classroom. So, um, so we already went over this, but I do want to say, I do think that somewhat as anarchism has bifurcated into a kind of philosophy and technology, which I think is actually not clearly right or left wing. It's perhaps something new or something different, let's say, because it has a heavy critique of centralization and particularly critique of socialism. But it also at the same point comes from a critique of capitalism, critique of governments, debasement of currency, so forth and so on. And I do see that, what we've seen particularly under the Trump administration is a fusion of cryptocurrency and government institutions. If you live in China, you have probably seen this. Bitcoin and decentralized cryptocurrencies are banned, but centralized cryptocurrencies, particularly centrally banked digital currencies, are quite popular and are backed by the government. So you're this is a pretty interesting technology, and I think my general feeling is that, like, based on the work of Bernard Stiegler, every technology is pharmacon. It could be a poison or a cure. It has both positive and negative valences. It contains within it contradictions, which may have to resolve dialectically. And therefore, we can imagine that this technology can be used as to quote Hal Finney, the recipient of the first Bitcoin transaction, as a tool to liberate and protect people rather than control them, even if what we mostly see right now is control. So kind of doing an archaeology of the philosophy and history behind these topics lets us understand how we can use them, how we can use these technologies in an emancipatory manner. And for those of you that have been involved in things like DAOs recently, we've seen DAOs do wonderful things, raise money for prisoners, for example, Assange DAOs, I think raised $12 million and helped free Julian Assange. And then you've also seen DAOs used for pure scams and, selling stuff to people and running some guy with the private key running away with the money. So again, we've seen all sorts of both, I think, the worst and the best human behavior in cryptocurrency. And that's why it's important to study. Okay, so how are we going to grade people? I don't know how many people have never taken a course at the News Center before, but if you haven't, you do indeed get a grade. An income. So the syllabus is just to correct the syllabus a little bit. Sorry, I need to get the sorry. I think there we go. Seminar attendance is 20%. So we're going to take attendance. Text presentations are 30%. In-class participation is 10%. And final work is 40%. So for those of you that haven't taken a course here, that's how they're graded. Let me just get back to the screen. So what this means is that you want to get above 60%. Pass between 60 and 80 is exceptional, is above 80%. If you don't care about grading, don't worry about it. Just pop in and hang out and do what you can. The particular assessments is that we will have a little presentation. That's that presentation will be done the last day. And this presentation will basically go into one cryptographic technology of your choice. So we're going to talk about that on the second or third day because we're going to finally get to technologies in the next session. This is the kind of before technology session. Again, we expect this presentation to be short. Again, 2 to 4 people, maybe 5. We'll see 5-minute lightning groups. And then the primary assessment will be a final essay or video on a cryptographic topic of your choice. Maybe it's privacy in Bitcoin, things like Zcash. Maybe it's DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. Maybe it's I remember once discussed, I was trying to get Jeremy Corbyn to understand what a DAO was. And I said, well, it's like a workers' council over the internet. He got really into it. There's all sorts of different things you can kind of understand and go deeper in, and I'm happy to provide further material. And you will get to choose one, and you can do 1,000 to 4,000 word essay or video. And yes, you can use AI, but you cannot only use AI. We do expect some human intelligence in there somewhere because AI is, for better or for worse, definitely not perfect. So today will be anarchist pre-technological concepts of decentralization and cryptocurrency. And I'm not going to go right now straight into that topic. I'm going to give you a broad overview of the course. So particularly, we're going to touch on the anarchist thought we're going to touch on the prehistory of secrecy. Then we're going to go into Proudhon, particularly looking at federalism, credit, decentralization, and then eventually the birth of the Austrian School of Economics and their debates with socialists in Vienna in the 1920s. So this is all kind of pre-World War II today. And cryptography is kind of born out of World War II, which we'll get into tomorrow. So I don't know if we didn't expect people to do the readings, so don't worry about it. But if you had done the readings, great. If you want to do the readings and have questions, we will do another Q&A on these readings in the next session. So again, how the readings work is there's primary readings and secondary readings. The primary readings, I know they seem a lot. I guess for the first session, they are a little bit of a lot, just because Proudhon is not a concise writer, let's say, and neither is Hayek. I try to be concise, so at least my piece, I think, is only 4 pages about the historical analysis of cryptography. That being said, most of the papers you read in this course, even though it seems like a lot, will actually be quite short. They may be a little dense. Things like the Bitcoin white paper, actually, to really read it thoroughly is not trivial, or some of David Chaum's work. But a lot of the readings you'll be doing are actually quite short. There'll be 2 or 3 pages, a manifesto. Cypherpunks write code. They tend not to write down books. That being said, there will be some books in the syllabus, and they're all good. You can read the whole book. They often have a lot of good introduction to the underlying technologies, but we didn't want to force everyone to read that because I determined that people may have different backgrounds in the technology, basically. So we want to give people a kind of wide variety of backgrounds. If you this is just sort of like a map. It's a map of a territory. You can find stuff that's interesting, which isn't in my map, but it's the map I use. And I think there will be pieces of that writing which will be important. There will also be, as you've noticed, secondary readings. I will go over the secondary readings to some extent in class. They're not as important as the primary readings, so they're optional. You can do them. You cannot do them. Just if you're interested, I would go for it. If not, feel free to skip. And you can dip back in later. If I say something in the course, which is interesting, you can always, the primary text behind the quotes are in the syllabus. So you can find that quote yourself and develop your critical ability to understand and read these texts uh, without me. But nonetheless, it's good, I think, to have this Q&A, and we'll cover both the primary and the secondary readings in Q&A. So I'll go back to the material of the first session. We will have on the second session. I just want to kind of give you a broad overview of what we're doing. We're going to go into crypto-anarchism. So crypto-anarchism actually predates Bitcoin, comes from the really the kind of 80s, late 80s, 90s, coming out of early work in the 80s and 70s, the invention of what's called public key cryptography. So public key cryptography lets individuals rather than states essentially hide their messages so only the intended recipient can decrypt or read the message. And this has huge effects on money, contracts, the nature of violence on the state. And we're going to read the primary text in this, which is David Chaum's Blind Signatures for Untraceable Payments. That's the first anonymous payment scheme. That's very influential to Bitcoin and everything else that came afterwards. David Chaum is a genius. He invented many other things such as mixnets, anonymous communication channels. That's what I work on as CEO of NIM. He also invented anonymous credentials, ways to prove something about you, like I'm under 18 or over 18, or I am, I don't know, EU citizen, or I'm not an EU citizen. To prove this in what's called zero knowledge. So it's related, kind of an early simple form of zero knowledge proofs. And then the cypherpunks were sort of a group of people that formed around these technologies. They weren't particularly close friends with David, like Thomas May, Eric Hughes, Jude Milhone. They come all over the place. So and we'll go into that in a second. But I would say politically very different. Someone like Eric supported privacy, but wasn't particularly left or right wing. Jude Milhone was, say, more left wing, came from the counterculture hippie movement, founded the magazine Mondo 2000 that eventually became Wired. And Thomas May, who founded the term crypto-anarchism, was, a raging racist. So they're all over the place. And in this session, we'll also look at probably the most important book. So what's going on right now, which was actually published in 96, called The Sovereign Individual, which predicts the collapse of the welfare state and transnational elites basically finding ways to use information technology to make lots of money and also avoid taxes. So this is by James Davidson and William Rees-Mogg. If you know the name Rees-Mogg or that rings a bell, that's because it is indeed the father of the conservative patrician, who was indeed a traitor. So that's probably one of the more important books in the canon. So I'm going to go over this part. So what happened, just to get a broad notion of what crypto-anarchism means. So you have anarchists, who we're going to go into shortly. And then what happened is Whitfield Diffie and Marty Hellman in 1976 invented something called public key cryptography. So previously, cryptography, the hiding of secrets, has always been a secret of the state, really primarily used by militaries and governments to communicate. They were definitely not used by ordinary people. And the reason they weren't used by ordinary people is because in order to encrypt and decrypt something, you had to have two keys, and only governments had the kind of hierarchy and organization to give people keys. Keys can be thought of as numbers. We'll go into this much more deeply later, but essentially they're like a secret. And if you have that secret, it's really a big number, you can read a message or send a message securely. So this got put out into the public ecosystem by Diffie-Hellman, published academically. And then this guy called David Chaum, who was a student up at Berkeley at the time, is a friend, and maybe if we're lucky, he can stop by the seminar. David Chaum basically said, hey, really, it's not just hiding the message, which is important. It's also hiding the metadata. who is talking to whom. If, I can gain a lot of information if I know that, for example, I don't know, Khamenei is talking to Putin or Trump is talking to Putin or whatever. There's a lot of information that's leaked when you communicate over the internet. So, for example, if we're all in the Zoom channel together, if a adversary like Palantir, the NSA, or whoever is watching this Zoom server, they can kind of figure out who's all in this classroom, even if our communication to the Zoom server is encrypted by just watching when the internet kind of turns on and turns off at each of our computers. So again, don't worry about understanding it all. We're going to go into the methods quite deeply later. But David Chaum said, hey, we can invent technologies which allow us to anonymously communicate like mixed nets. And then he also said, hey, we can invent anonymous credentials, which allow us to be a little bit later to prove things about ourselves while maintaining our privacy. And this could lead to privacy enhanced cash or e-cash, which is a purely digital form of cash. This all comes from one guy, the genius David Chaum. And at the same time, when Chaum was inventing all of this work, you had in San Francisco, you had the counterculture. And you had these protests, the free speech movement in the University of Berkeley. And that one of the interesting things that came out of these protests was actually computers are being thrown away by Berkeley, and hippies, including Lee Fesselstein and others, picked the computers up, put them in kind of radical bookstores. And this is one right here called community memory. And then people could then use those computers to kind of leave notes for each other, communicate. So this is before personal computing. You kind of had community computers, Resource One, People's Computing Center, so forth and so on. And from this combination of cryptography and the counterculture, you get people like Jude Milhone, who is here seen arrested, and that is indeed Montgomery, Alabama. She was an early feminist fighting for civil rights. Montgomery, Alabama was where student activists would go to fight for the right of African Americans to vote in the United States. And this around her and another fellow called Tim May, who wrote this piece called True Nims and Crypto-Anarchy. You got the birth of what you call the cypherpunks or crypto-anarchists. This was kind of a mailing list and a reading group in San Francisco that would come together and read David Chaum's work and say, wow, well, there's all these social and political implications of this work. So that's we'll go into what they thought those social and political implications were. And it should just be noted, this is all in the 90s, right? So this is kind of before the internet really even took off. This is definitely way before Bitcoin. So you really see there's been a lot of work that predates Bitcoin, that predates decentralization, cryptocurrency, blockchains, DAOs, Ethereum, that really has this kind of social and political character. It tends to go by the word cypherpunk. I think crypto-anarchism is a little bit more specific about what's going on. And then we'll go in the next session on January 25th in the cryptocurrencies itself. And I think there's two important texts here. One is Nick Szabo formalizing securing relationships on public networks. So that's where he develops the concept of smart contract. So the concept of contract and the importance of contracts we'll go into today that really comes out of anarchism. But the problem with contract theory is who enforces the contract, right? So if I have a contract between you and me and I break the contract, the ultimate enforcer of the contract tends to be the violence of the state. Could we imagine non-violent, non-state enforcement of contracts? And this is invented by Nick Szabo, who again, very, very much let's say classical libertarian, currently very much, I would say, supporter of Trump and whatnot. But he really said we can imagine that contracts can be done in code, and maybe they can't cover everything, but they can definitely cover monetary relationships, and monetary relationships such as Bitcoin or digital cash and smart contracts are going to be very crucial technologies for the future. So again, he thought of that in 1997, kind of towards the dying days of the cypherpunk movement. And the concept, it was thrown out there on the internet and kind of just died. No one really thought about it very much for about 10 years. And the cypherpunk mailing list kept going. Few experiments, digital money now and then, nothing so exciting. And then an anonymous coder called Satoshi Nakamoto, which could be a pseudonym, could be a group pseudonym. Pseudonym is just, again, a fake name. We know it's not a real person, or at least there's no real person called Satoshi Nakamoto. Wrote a PDF called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And then a few months later, put the code online, and that was the beginning of Bitcoin. And then he eventually, a few years later, disappeared. And that is what kind of led to cryptocurrency today. So I would recommend reading. We're going to read together this whole paper because there's a lot of important points in this paper, particularly important peer-to-peer, keeping the miners anonymous. Why do we do Bitcoin mining? These things are not well understood, and they really change the paradigm completely from the paradigm of anonymous eCash put forward by David Chaum. So as a disadvantage, it's no longer private, but as an advantage, it's decentralized, while the privacy enhanced work of David Chaum required a central kind of bank to kind of understand and make sure no one was faking money. And then we're going to read some of the political ramifications of Bitcoin by Amir Taki, who might stop by the course, and his new project DarkFi called The Coming Storm. And just to give you a little bit of background into what happened, we're going to do this briefly, but one of the important events that people kind of don't talk about too much anymore, but was vastly important in shaping the cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists and Bitcoin was the interesting, hilarious, but strange and very much real fight by programmers against the Church of Scientology. So the internet was taking off, people were sharing information, and someone decided to leak the Church of Scientology's secret documents onto the early internet. And the Church of Scientology decided that everyone who touched those documents had to delete them. They didn't want documents spreading for whatever reason. They were probably a bit embarrassed because they think their theology involves space aliens and whatnot. And they went after the crypto anarchists and cypherpunks in particular because these are the people that were spreading the knowledge about the Church of Scientology. I think the Church of Scientology is a very American, bizarre cult. I don't think it really exists. Maybe it does outside the United States, but they have a lot of money and they have a lot of lawyers and a lot of good connections with the government. So they would force people's email servers that were sharing this knowledge to shut down. And this very much got a lot of people more interested in decentralization because they said it doesn't seem fair that on the internet we can share information, yet it can get shut down. So we're seeing this today, this same kind of unfolding. If you look at the work of, say, I don't know, Anna's Archive, right? Or these kind of file sharing sites I'm sure many people use to share PDFs of otherwise books that require access to JSTOR or some other copyright data. And this was a kind of early version of that struggle. And the whole kind of anonymous social movement, which later became kind of more important, and the Tunisian Egyptian Arab Spring, originally started as, well, a little bit of a weird cult from 4chan with some interesting, let's say, beliefs. We'll go into those later, but they also started going after Scientology. And there was a lot of work on how we can make communication anonymous. So again, some of the work that led to things like Tor, which is an anonymous way to access the internet, kind of like a decentralized VPN, come out the cypherpunks and their fight with Scientology. Another thing which came out is WikiLeaks, right? So WikiLeaks came out of the same mailing list that Bitcoin came out of. Bitcoin was used by Julian Assange to avoid, basically the US government was so angry at the leaking of the Iraq war logs, they tried to shut down his payment processor servers in Switzerland. This is me actually hanging out with Julian. And this is, I think, spy footage, but I got a hold of it through a court case, hanging out with him in the Ecuadorian embassy, discussing cypherpunk and crypto-anarchism. And on the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day, if I remember correctly. And so what we see is that, the cypherpunks really were this like powerful, potent, interesting historical force that led not just to Bitcoin, but also to WikiLeaks, to Anonymous, to 4chan, all these things which are still important today. And there's been a whole kind of not so well understood aspect of cypherpunk. You both had connections to the anarchist movement in Spain. This concept of maybe Bitcoin is not fair. Can we make a fair coin, a fair labor, a way to fairly exchange value? Can we make privacy enhanced Bitcoin? The first work on that was Dark Wallet by Amir Taki and Cody Wilson. Cody Wilson later went on to do 3D gun printing. I mean, Amir is now doing privacy enhanced trading with DarkFi. So again, there's lots of interesting connections here. It's not, I just want to say it's not just Bitcoin and blockchain. The cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists have been incredibly technologically fertile. All sorts of things from 3D printed guns to anonymous technology like Tor and Wiki and leaking sites like WikiLeaks and this really move for government transparency have all really come out of the cypherpunk crypto-anarchist nexus. And we're going to distinguish a bit between cypherpunk and crypto-anarchists when we get to that point. I would say crypto-anarchists are people that want no government, while cypherpunks are more interested in just preserving individual rights in the digital age. And finally, we're going to end on the last session on February 1st with network states and anarchist alternatives network states. What is it? Is maybe a network state, maybe it's even anarchist. So we're going to read Balaji Srinivasan's The Network State. This is the book that kind of coined the name. It said, well, look, if the nation state's melting down, which was predicted in that book, The Sovereign Individual in the 90s, what are we going to replace it with? And looking at Dubai and Singapore, and also this ideology of exiting a dying system, exiting a falling empire, exiting a corrupt nation state. There's been an interest in network states. How can we basically, just as we build startups or we build cooperatives, could we build our own state within a state or outside of a state? Balaji imagines that state should be ran kind of as startups. And he's very much, that idea has been very popular in libertarian circles right now. You're seeing experiments, as we mentioned earlier, in Guatemala with Prospera. Then we're seeing the venture capitalists who were historically not involved in crypto-anarchist or cypherpunk technology get very excited by it. Perhaps the defining text is Mark Andreessen's The Techno-Optimist Manifesto, where he kind of says, why technology is so amazing and why particularly under the Trump administration, we should accelerate American technology and accelerate American domination through the technology, but how this is kind of good for the whole world. So that's Mark Andreessen's belief. And there's some critique of this from, I think, a more classical anarchist libertarian angle from Jared Hope, who is a founder of a cryptocurrency wallet called Status, and now a social movement called Logos. And Peter Ludlow, a famous philosopher who was one of the earliest philosophers interested in crypto-anarchism. And they have a new book, which we'll share with you, called Farewell to Westphalia, where it's talking about how nation states were formed at a particular junction, the Treaty of Westphalia, and the kind of forming in the 19th century, 18th century, and how that era is over and something new is emerging that will fundamentally replace the nation state. We'll also, during this class, do final presentations. So I'm going to take a little pause here and say, are there any questions about what we're going to cover, how the grades work, what's going, things that you want to see covered? You can type the questions, you can ask them. I see some stuff going on chat. But I just wanted to give you kind of a brief overview of the course before going. Okay, cool. Yeah, and that Verso books looks good. Thanks for the link, Grayson. Any questions or concerns? Yeah, exactly. Prospera is pretty dangerous. I would agree, Sinza. I am, by the way, the co-founder of the Progressive International, so we are watching that very carefully. Proudhon is very different than Kropotkin and Hakim Bey. He's worth reading. I would say that Proudhon is one of the most neglected thinkers, but everything from both the libertarian and kind of, I would say, kind of anarcho-collectivist communist thing, they really do have him as their founding father. So he's worth taking seriously. We'll take him seriously later today. And yeah, great seeing all. Okay. Yes, there is a place you can chat. There is a Google Classroom, which I've never used before, but I hope you all will invite to it. Does everyone here have access to the Google Classroom? Um, yes, no, yes, no, maybe. Okay.
Well, we have a link to it in our email, so I think everyone should have an access to it.
Try the link out and we can work on that. We can work on that afterwards. And yeah, I'm familiar with the debates that large multinationals have already solved. Some various forms of oligopolies or monopoly capital, let's say, has solved the social calculation problem. That's even, Fred Jameson has the American Utopia book, which kind of was an essay, which then inspired the People's Republic of Walmart. Again, it's a hard question. I'm not going to go down particularly. I'm not convinced that large multinationals have actually solved the problem. I'm also not convinced that any of the competing solutions are any solve the problem or realistic, including anarcho-capitalism obviously doesn't actually exist in today's environment. Okay, cool. So if you don't mind, since I don't want to run out of time, I'm gonna do the philosophy of secrecy, then we're gonna take a 10-minute break. So did anyone have time to take a look at the philosophy of secrecy?
Yes, that was the small paper that you sent initially,
Yeah,
right?
it's like 4 pages. It's a little dense though. So
Yeah.
okay, well I'm glad someone had taken time. If not, you don't need to read it. It's not, but it's just kind of, I think, useful to understand some of the dynamics going forth in privacy. So, if you like just look at privacy from a political or philosophical angle, you don't typically get philosophers. What you typically get is human rights scholars and mostly lawyers. You often even don't get coders. So, if you say, what is privacy in the United States? It's not a right, but it's kind of enshrined in case law because the United States is based on the English system, of common law. And Warren and Brandeis, the famous justices, judges, have this famous article called Right to Privacy. Then after World War II, it got put in the United Nations Article 12 is the right to privacy. If you live in Europe, you're probably more familiar with data protection, which is a slightly different concept, more around the autonomy of data and your ability to consent or not consent or withdraw consent from data processing. Again, data protection mostly comes out of thinking about data after the Holocaust. So we had, we'll go into this a bit, I think, in the next session, but obviously we've seen these large databases develop. There's a great book called IBM on the Holocaust, which kind of goes into it more deeply. And there's pretty good evidence that the mass collection of data combined with an abusive government can lead to very dark places. So there was this desire by Germany and Sweden, in particular, to rectify this with data protection laws. You never really developed data protection laws in the United States, which is why you have no privacy on things like Instagram or social media, Twitter, so forth and so on. But effectively, we want to step back. Why do we have privacy? Well, privacy law developed because it's very easy to violate privacy due to technological development. And it was really photography that kicked it off, and Warren and Brandeis' right to privacy. And there's a question of like, is this normal? So folks like Zuboff imagine in her well-known book about surveillance capitalism, imagine that this is kind of mutation within capitalism. We had kind of normal productive capitalism, but now capitalism has become in some way malignant because it's now spying on trying to control the behavior of consumers. So Zuboff, who people I think would think is some sort of left-wing socialist, actually is really a defender of, if you really read it, almost like a Hayekian standpoint that, it's really the behavior control by Silicon Valley threatens individual consumer choice and rational political voting on this level, very liberal, and this is very dangerous, and so we have to stop it. We have to regulate the big Silicon Valley giants out of existence. That's how we preserve privacy. Now, alternative viewpoint is a viewpoint of Whitfield Diffie, who's kind of more, say, anarchist inclined, definitely from the counterculture in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, where he said, well, rather than rely on laws to defend privacy, we're going to rely on cryptography. And even, an individual's privacy is opposed to government secrecy. So that's why he invented public key cryptography. So what I want to point out, and I'm going to go into this, this will be one of the kind of threads that connect the whole course, is that secrecy, we think of privacy as belonging to individuals, but cryptography really comes out of secrecy. And secrecy is the domain of the state. And that information organization, how you organize information, who gets access to it, that's called access control. How do they identify themselves? Authentication. All that stuff. So when I go up to a guard, he asks me for my ID, that's authentication, and then you can determine if I'm allowed into a building or not. That's access control. This all starts happening in the digital world, and therefore secrecy is constitutive of the information organization of the modern states. And therefore that kind of explains why things, the classical kind of Enlightenment viewpoint is that liberal viewpoint would be that the state should become more transparent over time. But what we've actually seen, particularly, I think, with WikiLeaks, but also the case with Trump and the case with this kind of move of a lot of nation states into kind of various forms of despotism, is that what really runs despotic and authoritarian nation states, of which we're seeing an increase, it's not an average, we're seeing increasing amounts all over the world. Every country is kind of moving towards authoritarianism. One of the foundations of government authoritarianism is government secrecy. And government secrecy is because that's kind of how governments form. There are certain sacred secrets they would control. And then the second thing is they don't want their citizens to have privacy, because the surveillance on population is what enforces the control from states. So this is the rise of secrecy in terms of government secrecy is actually a historical continuity. And so the spread of cryptography from the state to the individual is actually, from the viewpoint of, I don't know, political theory, is a move of sovereignty, the ability to make decisions from, from the state, right, to individuals. And so cryptography is not just defense against the state. We shouldn't just have this kind of, the state just forgot to legislate privacy rights. The state, by definition, needs to surveil its population. Otherwise, there's no boundary to state. If it's not surveilling its borders, there's no who's in the state, who's out the state, who's a citizen, who's not a citizen. Obviously, hugely important debates now in countries from Turkey, with Syrian refugees, the United States, with migrant detentions with ICE. This question of who's a citizen and who's not a citizen, and who makes decisions, and do those decisions have to involve the citizens? These are incredibly important, and it becomes a much bigger discussion than just, we need to do a new, let's say, Privacy Act in California, so Google and Meta aren't spying on me all the time. And digital technologies really takes this discussion and these problems into hyperdrive. So in order to understand these problems, we have to go as far back as possible. And it's true, there does seem to be some evidence, and I have the references here, and you're happy to question them on me. Question me on them. But it seems like there is pretty good evidence of biological bases of privacy. Animal, maybe just for safety reasons, if nothing, if not, animals tend to withdraw into, confined spaces to sleep and to rest. Humans in caves being one example of that. Even if you think about animals that don't have kind of dwellings or caves, it's usually some sort of often moving, but territory. The kind of nomads of Deleuze being one way to think about this, but it seems to be kind of universal across a lot of biological species of some form of distinct territories. Monarch butterflies have, for example, ancestral grounds in Mexico. They fly up to the United States, then they fly back down. So these are kind of fairly well-defined evolved territories. And then there's kind of weird evidence from anthropology. I mean, it is interesting, like why people don't have sex in public. why is that considered kind of strange? And in fact, it seems to be across most cultures that's considered pretty strange, or at least not default, and that many human most, but not all tribes did kind of prefer human mating in private dwellings. And that if you see, even in the kind of early Paleolithic with caves all the way to the Neolithic era with early villages, even before the development of hierarchy as such, people had dwellings, you know, Skara Brae in Scotland would be one evidence of this, Catahoulak and whatnot in Turkey. So you have this some kind of anthropological basis of some desire for privacy, not to be completely public. I'll get to you one second. And then the first law code, Hammurabi's law code, which is kind of, end of Neolithic into the Bronze Age. In Babylon, you had a law specifically against the intrusion of people into other people's private dwellings. Yep. So go for the question, Nebo. Nebo, I apologize.
I just thought about Genesis P. Orridge experiments, if you know that
Yeah, very
they
much.
organized a commune where they decided to make no walls in the commune, no walls between any rooms, even the bathroom. So they discovered that the need for privacy is not a social construct, actually, because they did this experiment.
And then what happened with the experiment? Did people like it? Did they dislike it? Did it work?
So they disliked it very much, and they found out that you actually need some sort of privacy, and because they were trying to experiment with like taking off some different social constructs that they were experiencing as hippies. So then they decided that you actually need walls and you need private spaces to live in the commune. And yeah, this just
Okay, well that's really I'm familiar with the chord Genesis Peorage from industrial music and whatnot. But I was not familiar with that experiment. That's awesome. So yeah, there's some notion of privacy that kind of let me just there's too many things going on the screen. Give me one second. Let me move that up there. Just want to keep my eye on the chat. So yeah, there's lots of evidence that there's something about privacy which comes at least with being an individual. You can argue about individuals as well, but there's something there. And then you had, I think, maybe more classically, you had the division between public and private is first formalized by Aristotle, where the public is kind of the positive valence, the good place to be, and the private is kind of viewed as not so great, where public, the agora, the marketplace, which will come up again and again in libertarianism, and the state and the theater, the theater again kind of changes into the court, right? The public is where decision making and argument happen. It's in the polis, right? And it's very valuable. And the private realm, privacy is happening in the house, right? The oikos, the economic, the involved women and children who are Aristotle, says are idiots in modern parlance because they don't participate in the public life. Now, Aristotle does qualify this. He sort of says, yeah, when you do science, you might need some quiet, some alone time. Same if you're doing philosophy, you might have private questioning, even though, again, a lot of philosophy for Aristotle come from conversation, like Socrates, from a dialectic, let's say, the early Greek version dialectic, which is, thinking through things collectively in a group. That's what we're doing today. So if anyone has a comment, you just type it in or raise your hand. If I don't see it, just interrupt me. It's fine. And we'll have some space for comments at the end of each little section. We'll hopefully get to pre-home today. Gotta kind of speed up a little bit. But Aristotle basically argues that, this, philosophy comes from individual questioning, but it's not inscribed by law. If you kind of break public norms in your private life, you get killed. That was, Socrates, his private philosophical work, his individual work was against the greater values of the polis. And the transition continues in Rome, right? So the word privacy is from Latin. Privatus is the state of deprivation, being out of the public. And the public administration happens through the church, and the church administers the holy secrets of the Bible. So this kind of empire of the mind replaces the church. And there's actually even older stuff, which is a little bit more tangential. The earliest form of cryptography, when we've kind of seen things that might be encoded, is actually Egyptian hieroglyphs. There's some debate if Egyptian hieroglyphs were encoded or not, maybe jokes against the pharaoh. There's definite evidence that's very widespread that in places like Assyria, Babylon, Ur, even the ancient city of Ur from Sumer, they didn't really have cryptography, but they would write on the state secrets, which were often secrets about the agricultural cycles, how the agricultural cycles related to the astronomical cycle. So it's this whole, at the very formation of the state, what is the state interested in? It's interested in feeding people and maintaining, and it maintains control because you could does these public works and ziggurats and whatnot, because you could basically store extra food. You can store extra food because the state maintains some control, some knowledge that you didn't have, that was cross-generational, that was written down. And this knowledge was typically an early state secret. On those cuneiform tablets, it would literally, people would write, "Do not read." And that was how you said, "Do not read unless you're a priest or the king or whatever." And okay, they weren't defended cryptographically, but there was some notion of secrecy and access control at the very formation of the state itself in ancient Sumer. Now, what happened with privacy is it turns around. It turns around the time of the Enlightenment. John Locke's second treatise of government is probably I think maybe the first place where privacy is really thought about positively. That what the rise of the bourgeois and merchants and, well, and people said, well, look, you need a private domain where you own property, and that's defended against your government, defends against the public political life, that you have rights that are somehow natural or inherent. This is very obviously important in the American Revolution and French revolutions. And one of these rights tends to be some form of privacy. It's given a more sophisticated treatment, and we'll see this come back again and again. And utilitarianism. J.S. Mill probably gives a slightly better reading than Bentham, where the essential argument, which I still think is the mainstream framing of privacy today, is that the public government should only interfere in private liberties to prevent harm to others. This is like a kind of negative freedom. And so where did the nation state come from? So Schmidt has like 3 different books on it and changes his mind, it seems, and doesn't really clearly figure it out. But you say, okay, maybe it's secularization of theology. We're all familiar with that. Agamben's made that very popular. Maybe to quell civil war. Also, Agamben goes into this, but it's really in the concept of political. But Schmidt was Catholic. I don't know why I have a Heidegger picture there. So I somehow messed my pictures up when I was making the slides. But Heidegger, Schmidt, both Nazis, so kind of interesting on that level. But the last lesser known theory, which we're not reading this course, but it's worth looking into, is that the nation state descends from the keeping of secrets. So that's in Roman Catholicism in form, where he relates the keeping of spiritual secrets and the keeping of agricultural secrets. This arcanum then gets transferred to the nation state. The nation state now keeps military secrets, keeps secrecy about its formation, about its people. And this really, the formation of the state can be considered a way of structuring information, particularly, again, as I said earlier, information about agriculture, structuring information over time, generalizationally. And as I said earlier, we have this very early form of access control, the one who knows, or Mudu, in what's called secrecy statements and cuneiform. And these can really be thought about as, just to go back, as classified documents, right? So the beginning of the nation state, you really have, or sorry, not even nation state, the beginning of hierarchy and cities in ancient Sumer, and then empires, you had classified data. And so what's interesting is that even you say, well, look, it doesn't seem like the Romans and the Greeks are kind of against privacy, against secrecy. Not so far, right? So you saw these ancient secret rites, mostly connected to fertility, persisted into Greek times with a kind of fertility cults of Demeter, Astarte, the mother goddess, the Dionysian rites, kind of big, but these are all based on secret Gnostic knowledge that you would get knowledge up from, and then you'd have some revelatory experience. And then, of course, the Romans, I mean, their entire apparatus was a giant bureaucratic information system, right? So the Romans really took it to the next level. And then what you saw, confession. No, privacy continues, I think, from the Roman Empire, spiritual secrets, which spiritual governance into the public governance becomes a spiritual governance of the church. And that's super, 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 super important. These kind of secret societies survive, the everything from Blanqui Society of the Equals, the Jacobins, to the whatever it is going on with the Republic of Letters in the US. These kind of Enlightenment, rational thinking comes from Freemasons, secret societies. It's all pretty well documented. You can go into that if you want. But effectively, the church naturally deals in secrets. There was no public literacy. And secrets even really gave birth to science, right? People were looking for the true names of things. If they knew the true name, they could control something. This was a very ancient belief structure that persisted into the birth of physics with Newton and whatnot. And then cryptography, the ability to hide things so only the people can read it. Again, lots of examples here. I'll just mention a few. Interestingly enough, people with secret messages were very important for the military. That's particularly the Caesar cipher. We have the first kind of encryption was named after Julius Caesar, who would use it to send secret messages between his troops. Even earlier forms of cryptography are used in Greece, Sparta, that would have encryption, decryption via essentially a string. And cryptography in its modern form really comes out of, like most things, the Middle East. It got systematized by the Persians and through in the Arabic empires, who basically were using much more complex ways than the Romans and the Greeks to hide their communication. They use essentially what's called ciphers. And we'll go into ciphers, I think, in the next course because it gets pretty mathematical. But nonetheless, like statistical cipher breaking, how to break ciphers statistically, how to encode things statistically. This actually predates digital technology and was systematized pretty early on in the kind of like the, I don't know, 1000 or so AD in the Middle East. And you saw at some point at the kind of Renaissance, this kind of fork in the road between practical information about secrets and occult things, which are like mystical secrets. And then, so the arcanum kind of separates. So the arcanum is the secrets of the state and society, and they separate into occult secrets and practical secrets. And you get from occultism, you do get a lot of science and practical secrets from the military and the government. And there's a lot of work here. And so essentially what happens is all the emerging city-states, again, we're talking about before the nation states, particularly at the Renaissance, you're seeing all the Arabic and Persian kind of methods of cryptography being imported back into Europe. And then every emerging city-state like Florence or whatnot, they would all have something, in England was called, I think, eventually called the Black Chamber, which there'd be specialists who were often from theological school, who were looking for secret messages in the Bible. And the princes and kings said, hey, we can use these people because they're really good at statistics, looking for secret messages in the Bible and other occult stuff. We can use them to hide military messages and economic messages. And so each city-state incorporated these new modern secret techniques. So examples such as Cardano and Della Porta. And this was happening at the same time science was becoming more and more open. And then you have some kind of feelings about secrecy, but it's never really studied. I think George Simmel kind of gave us the first kind of sociological or privacy enhanced kind of view on privacy, where he kind of defines secrecy as just the control of information. And Bach, who's a more later philosopher, says, okay, how can we prevent people from accessing this information? But this again becomes very individualistic based on kind of the J.S. Mill and Locke reading. And I would say, privacy is not just the application of secrecy to the individual, but we have to really think that secrecy has always come with methods of enforcement, and these enforcement methods are effectively cryptographic. And that's where cryptography comes from. That's the importance of cryptography. And so the state itself is not a agora. It's not necessarily a rational place for discussion and public discourse, but it's an information organization for the control and transmission of secrets. And again, you want to basically make your population. I've looked at Agamben's stasis text on this. When the early states are forming, you saw these tribes, these families. In America, you would say the McCoys and the Hatfields, and ancient Greece, you would say, I don't know, blood feuds, really Antigone would be the classic play here. But nonetheless, you wanted to prevent this kind of civil war between families, individuals, and blood feuds. And so you want to dissolve these private ties between individuals and make individuals and their ties transparent to the state. Now, in ancient Greek times, this was a voluntary virtue, but of course now with mass surveillance and so forth, it's more of an enforced prescription. And so that's why we have this phenomenon today where you have an increase, not in government transparency, but legislation to increase surveillance powers. And it kind of happens regardless of what people think and regardless of the law. The NSA, in the classic example, the NSA can surveil the whole planet because laws only apply to Americans and there's foreigners in America, so we can apply spy on American citizens anyways. And this is what I consider a really historic shift of sovereignty from the state. The state takes away the privacy of individuals, gets transparency over its citizens, and the cryptography helps bring that back. And we'll go into that in the next session. So I think we should do a bit of Q&A. I did a lot of material, but it's all in the paper, so nothing new. But I'm happy to kind of chat about it. So go for it, Grayson.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have, first of all, I really enjoyed your introduction. Super concise and well said, and I'm looking forward to this. I have a sort of maybe annoying technical request, which is I think you have some kind of automatic gain control system for your microphone, and there's the mic level thing keeps popping up. I don't know if other people are seeing this, but it's very distracting because it goes on top of the slides.
Yeah, I'll see if I could turn that off.
Okay.
I don't know why that's on top of the slides. Maybe I can
It might be like going over to your virtual screen or something.
Yeah, it's weird. Usually that stuff should be out. I just assumed that wasn't slides. Thanks for warning me. I
Yeah,
might
no
have
worries.
this session, but I'll definitely fix it my next session.
Okay, cool. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Any other questions, concerns? That was a lot of material at once, but just basically pointing out broadly, secrecy has been around for a while. Cryptography has been around for a long time, and they're really important to sovereignty of the state and the relationship with individuals. No?
Well,
No?
I can just share a bit of my associations because first of all, I'm really inspired by this lecture and thank you really much for this course. So you were saying a lot about government as an organization that requires secrecy and how government is something that's created by this holding of secrets. But I think that there, like with crypto anarchism, there was also a parallel process going around, like with Gnosticism. So there were a lot of like mystical secret societies that were developed parallel by with the government, and they that were holding their own like mystical secrets. So I was wondering, how do you think what's the connection between them, and how do they relate with the secret societies with crypto-anarchism now, maybe?
Yeah, so we'll get there, I think, a little bit more in the next session, which is next week. But like secret societies are very old. So there's not just priests, but probably before the formation of uh let's say probably in the Neolithic era, if not before, there were kind of all anthropological evidence points that people like secrets, have secret societies. There is a lot of secret knowledge out there. There's knowledge which you have or you and your friends have that no one else has. So the phenomenon of secret societies probably predates the formation of, let's say, the city-state and the empire. And then most likely, what I want to actually argue is that, the secret society that controlled or that knew about agriculture and its relationship to like the stars, which is a big deal in every empire from like the Incas to the Sumerians. These were kind of secret societies that really took over. And the reason they took over and gained some form of domination and hierarchy is because they had some form of secret knowledge that not everyone had. And so that's why people worshiped them, thought they were gods, whatever they were able. It wasn't just pure violence. There was also some form of knowledge, I think. And then, of course, there are many different kinds of knowledges. States would collapse, individuals can maintain. So you see spiritual knowledge, particularly from the priestly class, became very important. There were, of course, huge fights over kinds of spiritual knowledge. Every religious, if you look at old religions, particularly pre-Christian things, Neoplatonism or things like the Druze religion in the Middle East, most religions, I'm not familiar with India, but I'm sure it's the same. Religions tend to be based on secret practices that only the people who are initiated into secret society know, right? And that this gives you some advantage, some power, maybe just some understanding that no one else has, and that these are heavily guarded secrets. I do think there's connection between these secret societies. Obviously, I think there's tons of work here on development of secret societies, then the Freemasons and the Enlightenment tradition, the philosophical salons pre the formation of nation state and the formation of science. I mean, Newton was a famous occultist, right? So public science is kind of a later formation. Historically, science and religion have been secretive, and the attempts to make them more public and more organized led to things like, the Catholic Church burning witches, Protestants burning witches, the combination of both the challenge to hierarchical power and the desire to make Christianity itself more transparent or legible by Martin Luther. These are all variations on a theme, and they can be thought of, I think, very productively between, in terms of secrecy, in terms of the relationship of like secrecy to society and the individual and whatever is emerging as the forms of political control at the time. Now, I think what's really interesting here is the formation of the state is what I really kind of keep a tie on, and that even when the state is formed, secret societies persist, right? So during the famous example, which I mentioned very briefly, is the Society of the Seasons of Blanqui, the early social societies, the working man's society from the Communist Manifesto, were almost always secret societies on the margins of the state. These societies often had various occult beliefs. You would see, I think, Society of Seasons, very related to I mean, if you read Fourier, the early utopian socialists, there's a lot of very occult things going on. And socialism is not a rational program. It's a naturalized occultism almost. And that the cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists are a modern day version of that, right? So just as you had, the communist movement or the anarchist movement were kind of these secret societies, the early socialists, guild socialists, whatever, fighting inside of the state. The cypherpunks and crypto-anarchists are, again, secret societies inside of the modern nation state dealing with digital states, right? So the state information organization transition from an analog formation that still exists in places like France to digital information of organization. And because of that, there's still a lot of occult things going on. So there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of explicit interest in the occult practices, myths, meditations. I mean, even in Silicon Valley, the formation of the computer revolution really comes to a large extent from a mixture of the formation of the New Left, the free speech movement, which is very libertarian to some extent. You should be able to say anything you want, with the profusion of secret knowledge from, say, India, yoga, the human potential movement, the Solon Institute. Uh, this all let the formation of the digital realm was not entirely like a rational corporate capitalist phenomenon. It really came out of secret societies, cultural societies, counterculture, and that it's not surprising that it persists to the current day. So if you go get involved in cryptocurrency, everyone wants to belong to DAO. The DAO gives you some ability to vote. So the interest in transparent government, but it's also still a lot of secret stuff going on. People are interested in secrecy, they want to maintain their secrets and form new kinds of secret societies. And this is all very closely, like, you'll see a lot of interest in all sorts of fringe, interesting occult thinking from otherwise what you would consider hyper-rationalized computer scientists and computer programmers involved in crypto-anarchism, cypherpunk, but like kind of Silicon Valley and computer technology at large. So, even one very basic example, if you look at Turing, who invented computer science, and you look at objections to artificial intelligence, just as Newton was very interested in the occult, Turing was very interested in communication with the dead. He said, well, one of the problems with AI is that maybe it doesn't have psychic powers and can't communicate psychically, maybe to the dead or to and so this stuff is much more common, I think, than is popularly understood. So I hope that helps. For secret societies, that the real key text is the George Simmel text, the Simmel text. That text kind of goes into the sociology of secret societies. But I don't know if anyone has reading recommendations of cool texts or interesting things on secret societies and occultism. I'd be very interested. Okay. Any other questions?
I was wondering if you were gonna. Can you hear
I
me?
can see
Yeah,
them.
I hope yes.
Okay, sorry. I couldn't see everyone's hands. Let me go for it.
I was wondering if you were gonna tell the story of PGP, of Pretty Good Privacy. Otherwise, I think it's like a really cool Promethean transfer of cryptography to the people. That would be cool to briefly mention.
Yeah, we're gonna do that, but next session. This is the
Okay.
pre-digital technology session.
Cool,
So,
nice. Thanks.
and I don't know if sorry, I'm trying to figure out if I can see everyone's hands. Sinza and then Amin.
Yes. Hi. How are you? Hope everything's well. Can you hear me
Thank you.
properly?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly well.
Okay. So just I've had some thoughts and made some notes, not just based on this paper that we just checked from, what's the name of this person? Harry Halpin, but also
Yeah.
trying to contrast it with some of my interests as part of my research here at the New Center. Mostly that's why I'm trying to talk right now, trying to come up and articulate these things. And what I'm interested in at the moment is what I call nonverbal outputs, in the sense of trying to come up with different vehicles to address nonverbal issues in the present state of things, usually defined as transnational capitalism, which try to be solved despite being nonverbal, as if they were discursive issues. And one of those main issues, I think, is the current state of what's known as profit economy, which not only has these axioms or axes related to economics and politics, but it's also heavily intertwined with the role of religion among the masses. If we think about masses as something different from the elites, right? Trying to difference those two demographical states. Elites are not masses and vice versa. Initially, you said, well, Halpin, right? Uh, Making a sort of recapitulation of the role of secrecy in the pre-agricultural age, puts this sort of examples coming from Aristotle or Socrates, where the oikos, the economics, are intended to be a separate space from the polis, the politics, which in present time, it's definitely not the case. We could even argue that economics, the oikos, it's on top of the polis and sort of determines it. And in that sense, we can see how they are deeply intertwined in the name of this idea of national security. I will say that is the main monad, the intertwined, the intersection between the economics and the politics have through secrecy, and in this case, secret societies. Um, I, but nonetheless, none of these positions, and maybe I'm going a little bit further ahead, but taking even into
Okay.
account the conclusion from Halpin, where he says, and I'm gonna just quote it briefly, that there is perhaps one aspect of being human that serves as the foundation of secrecy, that is the ultimate interiority of the human mind. I wouldn't say that any of these points end up addressing the current status of profit economy within nation states and its upholding between not only the elites, but the masses. If we try to use a more aggressive term, masses which are not willing to question the role economy has among politics end up becoming slaves. And I was wondering, what are the actual implications of, also as someone who has a deep interest in anarchism, and I will say that at some level, not sure if philosophically or morally, but at some level, I do try to guide myself as an anarchist or as someone who tries to challenge the current status quo of political subjectivity, that is the one of transnational capitalism. What are the actual implications of anarchically address the current state of transnational capitalism on a more effective or determinate fashion? Does cryptography can provide that even? If we consider that, for example, the conclusion, going back to Halpin, is that this in turn, talking about the secrecy of the mind, this in turn signals the increasing importance of cryptography in terms of maintaining human individual autonomy via secrecy. As the individual becomes more embedded in collective and social technical apparatuses, the concept of privacy may very well be replaced by a broader notion of autonomy. Nonetheless, this for me keeps sounding as profit economy rewashed, as not even having the intention of going further among that mindset. If we think about profit economy as the next logical step in history from the gift economy, which is the apparent break on the medieval age, which gave birth to international commerce. And in that sense, international commerce is nothing but secrecy. It's rather secular and it's rather public. That's why most people, go for the money, go for the bag. And that even holds more weight in present time and in the past, that any sort of philosophical discussion upon the occult or privacy or even security, which is why what we think when we think about secrecy and privacy in present time. It's a whole discussion on feeling secure and feeling safe. These are just like random thoughts. I'm not sure if I'm making
Yeah,
any
no, I
sense,
mean,
but yeah.
those are really good points. I mean, I am Halpin, by the way, so I'm that's my last name, so I can address at least what I was thinking when I wrote that. I'll try to at
Oh,
least
I'm sorry.
riff
You
what.
are Harry Halpin. I'm
No, no,
fucked
no
up.
worries. Yeah, no worries.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
don't
I'm
worry, don't
sorry.
worry. So, no, I
Things
do
language
somewhat
barriers,
vaguely.
Spanglish and stuff.
No problem. So what I would say, so I agree, you have a critique of the profit economy, and that you have this misidentification of the masses with the elites, and everything you said made a lot of sense. And I think you should write on this more, or if you have writing, feel free to share it with me or the group. Um, I do think that there is a relationship, though, between anarchism, which we'll get into in a second, and the rise of what you call the profit economy, or just capitalism as such. So when the kind of nation state was transitioning out of, well, it wasn't a nation state really, when you were transitioning from feudal monarchies to something that resembled the modern nation state through the
Exactly.
various French revolutions, which is what we'll look at, there was a lot of possible alternatives people could have taken. And we'll go into one of those, an anarchist one called federations in a bit, hopefully in this course, this session. And they were also very much kind of profit driven ones, and they weirdly enough they both kind of come from anarchism. So anarchism both has what you would call a left variant, which goes in the forms of cooperatism and socialism, anarchist collectivism of Bakunin, and anarchist communism of Kropotkin, and also has a capitalist version as well, which also comes from Kernel. Like it literally kind of comes riffing off the same guy, that becomes effectively some form of what you would call capitalist libertarianism. So this goes straight into von Mises and Hayek in particular. And so I think like the weird thing is that anarchism is kind of anarchism begins as a moral critique of what's considered unnatural feudal social relationship. And then it's very different, and we'll go into this in a bit, and maybe just go into this later. The relationship that anarchists have with social classes is very different than the relationship Marxists have. So Marxism, just to summarize briefly, believes in the overthrow of, for lack of a better word, the bourgeois by the proletariat. And if you read that the reading for this session, the general idea of revolution in the 19th century, you think maybe he's joking, but I don't think he is. Proudhon dedicates that to the bourgeois. He's saying, hey, bourgeois, you've been very successful in revolutions, and you're being held back by these second-rate dictators, kind of Trump-like people like Louis Napoleon, these kind of jokes, and by the monarch. Why can't the bourgeois and the proletariat ally together? That's a very, and I think he believes that at the time. And then, so I think anarchism go many different directions, and there's many different kinds of anarchism, and crypto-anarchism is just one kind. And so we'll be concentrating on that one because it deals with cryptography. And it kind of gives us blockchain technology. Now, in terms of the relationship of enterprises and secret societies, I mean, I think they're related, though. I don't think it's true. So there's the dream of Hayek and capitalists, anarcho-capitalists, that the market should be transparent. Secrets cause distortions in the market, but secrets also cause advantages, right? So what was the NSA mostly surveilling? Well, they were surveilling political distance, but they were also particularly surveilling foreign nations and foreign companies for trade deals. And so if you have some secret knowledge, you have some advantage. If you know everything from, you believe you have some secret knowledge that there's going to be a disease that kills all the grapes, so wine's price is going to go up, or you just believe like a coin, like whatever, Cardano, some altcoin will pump, or Bitcoin's price will go up or go down. That's secret knowledge. And so the concept is that the market kind of combines through behavior. The market still is transparent, but there's still a lot of secrecy within the individuals through the interiority of the mind or their secret society. So corporations, in the modern sense, come often, from, let's say, the formation in the Netherlands and whatnot, really are places that also had very strong, what you would call guild movements in the medieval seek. So how to like make bronze properly, how to make iron, how to make gold, how to make weapons, how to make food. These were all secrets. In the medieval era, this secret knowledge was transmitted through a guild structure, and this guild structure kind of evolves with a mercantile basis into the modern corporate structure. And in modern corporations, they have trade secrets, they have patents. The patents may be public, but only public for enforcement reasons. Earlier, they're secret. Not just governments, but companies tend to take secrecy very quickly. As soon as you get fired from a university or company, they cut your email, they cut your access. So I still think there's secrecy is still present in what appears to be transparent market societies. So there's a lot of other things you said, which I'd have to think about a bit more to go into. But I do think this notion of numerable outputs is very interesting, and I'd like to hear more about that. But let's go quickly to Amin, and then I think that's maybe it. Amin?
Yeah. So I don't want to anticipate too much since you mentioned this would be a pre-digital session. I just wanted to ask, purely out of impression, since I need to brush up on this, but in Nick Land's articulation of the blockchain technology through Cantor's diagonal method, he does come at a certain point where he does articulate that the blockchain, and essentially this is a epistemo-ontological question. The blockchain stops us from being post-Kantians, thus producing a synthetic transcendental through the production of what can be termed as absolute time, contrary to space-time. And that can be further articulated into questions of post-quantum encryption and retrocausality. So I'm really interested in how Catherine Malibu's transduction and notion of plasticity comes into play around. So
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question. We can go into Nick Land, and we are definitely going to Catherine Malibu, but I wasn't going to do that right now, because I feel like there's more advanced stuff, and we need to cover the basis of anarchism now. I mean, Malibu is this excellent, more recent work. She was interested in cryptocurrency. I'm not seeing too much of her recently, but she's still pursuing the anarchism, in particular her kind of notions of ontological anarchism from Reiner Sherman and whatnot. And so these are based on plasticity. If everything is plastic, if there are not, whatever essences and so forth, then you have a kind of philosophical or ontological anarchism. And I would say that very few crypto-anarchists have probably read Malibu, but whatever she says is what she's saying is, I would say, fairly coherent with what they're saying. In terms of Nick Land, again, Nick Land's very popular. Mostly, although very few people have read his Bitcoin text. I think almost no one I know has read his Bitcoin text. But I think Nick Land is, if you read like Techno-Optimist Manifesto from Andreessen, he's like probably one of the more powerful VCs right now. Mark Andreessen quotes, basically says, oh, who's the people that are really on the same wavelength as me in terms of techno-optimism? It's one of them is Nick Land, right? So there's a huge influence in Nick Land. I don't want to go into Bitcoin quite yet, so maybe we'll save the Nick Land Bitcoin stuff for the Bitcoin session, which is not next session, but this one after. But we can put that in optional reading, and if people want to discuss that, that's a. I would say my personal belief is I'm a little skeptical of where Nick Land is going, but it is interesting, and he is not stupid. He's definitely worth reading. And he makes fair points, but I'm more of a Hegelian than a Kantian, so we'll leave it at that. So yeah, prediction markets. Yeah, prediction markets. We should go into prediction markets. We can go into prediction markets a little bit later. I feel like that's probably something we shouldn't go into right on the first session. So I'll add some more about prediction markets in future sessions, because prediction markets, again, can we reveal secrets by using collective intelligence, and that actually ends up being very effective. So the classic pre-digital example is this thing where people all have to guess the weight of a cow, and the average tends to win. Okay, so let's keep going. So I was wondering, we don't have that much more time. I do want to get through at least the beginning. I think we should save the socialist calculation problem for next session. But I would like to get through Proudhon this session. So maybe we take a 5-minute break. You can go to the bathroom, whatever. And then we'll go into Proudhon. Or I could just go directly into Proudhon if people want. And maybe we can Do people want to go direct, or do people want to take a little break? What do you want?
I think you can go up to 4:30 tops, so maybe we could take that break and go ahead.
Okay, so we'll just do, okay, so we'll do as much Proton as we can. That's the one. But anyways, I don't think I think we will not get the social calculation problem. That's fine. We can do that next time. That's very closely. So what is mutualist anarchism? So the broad view of anarchism is people often think anarchism is kind of like not well thought through. I think David Graeber put it once, kind of dumb younger brother of Marxism. Actually, it's an older tradition, and it's alternative to both to socialism, based on individual contracts and this notion of equilibrium. So Proudhon was the inventor of the term anarchist, and his famous text Property is Theft, in his own theories. So anarchism is a very broad tint, and even pinning Proudhon down is very hard, because Proudhon is a very kind of wild and woolly guy. If you bother to do his readings, he writes in a very dramatic manner. Let's just put it nicely. But he tends to combine. Proudhon is not against markets, okay, and he's not for communism. In fact, he comes out very much against communism and very against socialism. And he's even mocking, not really Marx, because Marx wasn't really viewed as a big deal back then, but he's particularly mocking socialism, like of the Louis Blanc. And he's saying these socialist theories tend to be centralized, and this is both economically it won't work and is very dangerous. So he really believes in mutuality, that we should have mutual social relationships to some extent by contract and by consent, and this will maximize the freedom of individuals. And he changes the details a lot during his life. Again, one of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century. A lot of his texts aren't even in English. And so people tend to read the critiques of him without reading him. And it's true he wasn't, let's say, as sophisticated as Marx or Hayek, but given that he was the earliest, he had a lot of things to say that are worth reading. I also want to point out one issue with him, which people don't really go into, is his background, right? So, for people that, Hayek and von Mises were all kind of trained in economics, from the founders of libertarianism, Marx, the founder, let's say, communism and modern socialism, let's say, obviously heavily trained in philosophy, finished a PhD, from a fairly well-to-do bourgeois background. Proudhon was not from a bourgeois background. Proudhon was what you would call, he was from a peasant, almost a small farmer background. He was trained to be a printer. That's why he became interested. That's why he learned how to read and to write. He was recognized as having a lot of skills of reading and writing, but he was from a kind of backwater, mountainous part of France called the Jura, which becomes important to anarchism historically. The Jura is like kind of southern mountains on the border of Switzerland and Italy. He's from Besançon, I think. And people are like, oh, you're good at reading and writing, you should become a priest. And then he rejects the church. He gets a scholarship to go to Paris. He loses his scholarship, and he has to write for money. And in his spare time, he would print other people's things and copy edit and whatnot. And he never formed a party. Unlike Marx, he was pretty. Apparently, he talked to Marx. He met most revolutionaries. And his ideas were very popular, but he never tried to form an organization. He said, look, he's like, I'm an anarchist. I don't want an organization. I don't want followers. He hilariously, even though he says, I don't want followers, and then people say, oh, you'd be a great leader, and they elect him into the House, the French representatives, the House of Representatives, the French Senate, where he was not actually a friend of the Jacobin, who were he considered the centralized left. He was part of what people often consider the more reactionary elements, the Gironde, the mountains, the regions. He wanted some level of local decentralization. And he was involved in the 1848 revolution. He was kind of walking around, watching it happen. He supported it. He wrote lots of pamphlets, and it was kind of so crazy. Because he was an artisan, Marx maybe mocks them about this, but you have to remember he was one of the few thinkers who could actually do something. So when the Republicans who wanted to establish a more traditional democracy in France, they said, "Hey, we need to print out pamphlets about the Republic." They had to call Proudhon and say, "Hey, Proudhon, could you print our pamphlets for us?" Because he actually had a printing press and knew how to print things. So he's an interesting guy. He's got a good biography by George, I think George Woodcock is probably the most well-known. There's a few. And he was very involved in the 1848 revolution. And he wanted to explain why it failed. And this is and what were its barriers and why it happened. So he wrote this kind of crazy text. It's one of the primary readings called The General Idea of Revolution in the 19th Century. And you can see, the red flag, these sort of things started happening that, were quite interesting. And I'm going to read, I think it's worth it. So I'm going to give some key quotes. And I want to just mention these key quotes. So here is one key quote. He says, why did the revolution 1848 not work? Okay, so this is before the Paris Commune. So if Paris Commune is 1871, this is kind of the precursor. And he says, well, it didn't work because the revolutionists failed in their mission. They have since failed for all the same reasons. Total lack of economic ideas, the prejudice in favor of government, and the distrust of the lower classes which they harbor. So the revolutionaries are middle class, bourgeois, but they can't do it because they don't really have good economic concepts. They don't trust the workers. The necessity of resistance to invasion, this is the German invasion, and enormous concentration of forces kind of led to this principle of centralization, which was passed into dogmatism by the Jacobins, transmitted to the empire. And it's in this tradition, which 1848 happened, and which there was a kind of temporary government, which Proudhon was part of, and was put in jail afterwards over this. And he basically says, these revolutions are going to keep failing because the economic organization called for, as a necessary consequence of the complete abolition of feudalism, left without guidance, and therefore politics took place of industry in the minds of everybody. So it's not the best translation in the world, but what he's effectively saying is there's a lack of good economic concepts, which doomed the 1793 revolution and equally doomed the 1848 revolution. And therefore, we will not have a proper revolution, a successful one, until we kind of figure out what's going on with economics. And because you can't abolish feudalism and just create a nation state, a centralized nation state, which is his main critique of 1793. And if you don't have alternative to the centralized nation state, you're just going to get Louis Bonaparte back in. So that's the kind of central concept. That's why he wrote the text, right? And he says, well, one thing, what can we agree on? And so he says, we got to talk about credit. The peasant knows it. Knows of it. The whole politics. He, like the businessman, he says, well, the peasant and the businessman actually both kind of understand two things: taxes and interest. And the working class, which, Proudhon is a big fan of, marvelously fit for progress, and has been kept in ignorance as the true cause of its sufferings, has barely begun to stammer the word. It wants this thing called credit, and sees in this principle the most powerful revolutionary forces. In the matter of credit, the working man, the worker, knows but two things: his account with the baker and the pawnbroker's shop. I think that's probably still true today. And so when he says, well, you guys, you utopians, you're attacking competition. And I think he's going after Marx here. You want to refuse to accept the division of labor and, some of the classical anarchists and the whole industrial order. And the workers, they blame machinery, right? But no one wants to deny the utility and legitimacy of credit. And he actually says the perversion of credit is one of the most active causes of poverty. So what's one of the solutions to revolutionary situations is the expansion of credit, right? So again, Proudhon is not against the market, but he's like, well, the problem is the market is controlled by the bourgeois, by the kind of the remnants of the feudal aristocracy, and normal people, workers, and peasants. You have to remember Proudhon himself is a peasant, like he is supportive of the peasantry, unlike Marx, which kind of classifies the peasants as reactionary. He says, well, actually, the peasants should be supported, artisans should be supported. Marx imagines, just to contrast, because sometimes it's useful to contrast, that the centralization of capital in a large firm is kind of no one argues that you want to keep the decentralization, including that of peasants and workers, but you want to empower them. He says, well, you can only empower them if they can own their own property, they can own their own means of production, and so you need to encourage them to be entrepreneurial. So we need to give them credit. So really, even at some points, like Proudhon is a pretty serious guy. He fails, unfortunately, economically. He dies impoverished, but he tries to create a bank of universal credit where he says, well, look, we can give loans to each other. So he says all the workers can give loans to each other. It's almost like a microcredit, is what you'd call it nowadays. And so ordinary workers sent Proudhon money and trusted him to establish a bank of universal credit, which was then going to give loans to other workers. Now this failed. He sent the money back. He was very rug pull. Proudhon did not rug pull the French working class, but he was very interested in making this happen. He think this was a big lever that revolutionaries should push. So you see, he's not thinking like, okay, we have a revolution and things just automatically change for the better. They automatically socialize, or collectivize, or then the utopia. He's saying, well, what practical means, which I think very much differs. Marx describes history, but doesn't really talk too much about future-oriented practice. Proudhon and the anarchist tradition tend to talk about future-oriented practice. What kind of practical methods can we give people? And he has some critiques. He says, well, look, division of labor is great. He supports it, but it becomes more and more minute. And then just to do this other quote, the workman has been given over to more and more degrading subjection to machinery. That is, the effect of the division of labor, when it is applied, not only makes industry incomparably more productive, but at the same time deprives the worker in mind of body of all the wealth which it creates for the capitalist and speculator production. Right? So he says, look, the workers, the ordinary people, the artisans, the peasants, and he's pretty broad and stuff. I think he's broader than Marx. He wants, are the ones creating, and he does realize that industry and division of labor makes workers even more productive, but somehow they're not getting their fair share, and they're becoming more and more impoverished. And then he goes on this kind of rant against taxes. And I think it's interesting because people very much dislike taxes. He says it is not enough that the producer, and sometimes he'll use the word producer instead of worker, because he says they're the ones that are actually productive. And what he calls the capitalist is like a parasite on the producer. The producer, it is not enough that the producer pays for the liberty to manufacture, cultivate, sell, buy, or transport that the fiscal authority grants him. The assessments forbid him to hold property as much as possible, including inheritance from a father, an uncle, a rental, a purchase. So what you see in Proudhon, also interesting, is he's really against taxes. He's like, okay, well, the worker's already getting a bad deal in terms of their wages, and that bad deal is being made worse by taxes, right? So this is you can see this is very different critique than Marx, and actually I think if you look at it, has a bit more in common with classical libertarianism, actually. But and he also says, and then he kind of does a critique of authority. And this is what I wanted people to read. He says, the real problem is not just like taxes. Okay, credit can help, but he's like, he has these kind of, I would say, concrete concepts: lower taxes, increase credit. But he says the real problem is authority, and it's the church, the state, the land, money. No more authority. This is why he's anarchist, because he imagines that if we have no more authority, we can have the harmony, and just to quote Proudhon again, the harmony of the interest of one with the interest of all, that the collective and the individual, the identity, collective sovereignty, individual sovereignty will be reconciled. So he's not an individualist. He believes to maximize the power of individuals, but he also believes in collective sovereignty, collective formations, working man's associations. He's very interested in the unions, this sort of thing. That means that, and so what does no more authority mean? Debts are paid, servitude abolished, no more mortgages, rents reimbursed. The taxes shouldn't go to the church, the expense of worship, justice, the state. Everyone should get credit. This is free credit, equal exchange. People should freely associate. He imagines there should be education, work, property, whatever for all. He even says low price. Everyone should have a low price, but should be guaranteed. And this will stop antagonism, war, centralization. There'll be no more centralization, no more government, no more priest. And that society, a holistic society, which he believes can include everyone, not just a class society, can emerge. And the key points is that there should be in place of arbitrary law, which is established by the state, free contracts between individuals, and voluntary transactions. And he believes the thing called the principle of reciprocity, that these contracts should only be entered into if both parties gain. So they should have equitable and reciprocal justice in place of sovereign distributed justice, rational morals rather than revealed. I think he's talking about religious morals. And this is a very important point. Proudhon is not interested in dialectics. He heard about them, but he never read Hegel from Marx. I think he heard about them from Marx himself. But Proudhon is really interested in what he calls equilibrium. So he says, we want an equilibrium of forces rather than power, and economic unity rather than political centralization. So he imagines a world where everything, Proudhon really like contradictions. We'll go into that in a second. And the solution is some form of equilibrium. And just to go a little bit further, and then really with Proudhon, he's such an amazing writer. He's pretty crazy, but he's fun to read if you can find the good quotes in his long text. So he says, what is government? He says, to be governed is to have every operation, every transaction noted, registered, enrolled, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assized, licensed, authorized, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished, and under the quote unquote pretext, he's kind of against this notion of public utility and in the name of general interest. So he's saying he's against the individual kind of being put under the collective. He wants to see harmony between them two. You are placed under contribution, ransomed, exploited, monopolized, extorted, squeezed, mystified, robbed. And when you resist, at the first word of complaint, you get repressed, fined, harassed, tracked, like surveilled, abused, clubbed, disarmed, choked, judged, condemned, shot, departed, sacrificed, betrayed, mocked, ridiculed, outraged, dishonored. So he's really against centralized authority, and he says that is government, that is justice, and that is its morality. And he said, why is it that socialists support this in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity? So he's actually very against certain varieties or most of I don't think he would really consider himself a socialist. He definitely wouldn't consider him a communist. He goes into more detail on that later. He says, with the revolution, it is another matter. Blah, blah, blah. We'll go back. And he says, will you join us? Will you join the compact and form part of a new society? Do you promise to respect the honor, the liberty, and the property of your brothers? Do you promise never to appropriate for yourself by violence, by fraud, by usury, nor by interest? Very much against interest. The products or possessions of another. Do you promise never to lie or deceive in commerce or in any part of your transactions? So that's how he views freedom. So it's a very different view, I think. And he kind of goes into this a bit more, and I'm gonna stop. But I want to kind of get through at least the beginning of Proudhon, and then we'll go into the Marxist critique of him. When it goes into contradictions, right? So he says, well, and he writes this kind of manifesto, let's say not against, what is, so the first text is like a take on revolution. And then he says, well, what is the economy? And Proudhon's general thinking, again, he's not in dialectics. He thinks that he believes that we have these kind of mystified artificial social constructions that hide an underlying natural order. And this natural order is you have two things in opposition, and rather than abolish them or supersede them or aufhebung like Marx, you have an equilibrium between the two. So he's against kind of insurrection, and he's basically for some form of reform, and he just has to outline his theory of reform. And a lot of things that people credit to Marx took from Proudhon, for better or for worse. And Proudhon basically points out, I don't know if he's the first person to, I think Ricardo points this out, and many others point this out, but he definitely goes into it. Use versus exchange value. And so he's very into free exchange. He said the very fact that I, as a free purchaser, am judge of my own wants, judge of the fitness of the object, judge of the price I wish to pay. So he's not for the abolition of money per se. He occasionally goes off into labor notes and this sort of stuff, but he wants a fair exchange. And that you, on the other hand, as a free producer, control the means of production, and you have the ability to reduce your expenses. Absolutism forces itself as an element of value and causes it to oscillate between utility and opinion. But this oscillation, the oscillation of prices, really, is but an effective contradiction which engenders unexpected phenomenon. I think talking about like crisis. For he says, in value, there's nothing useful that cannot be exchanged, nothing exchangeable if it not be useful. Otherwise, why would you exchange it? You can argue on NFTs and stuff, but this is Proudhon's thinking. Value and use and value and exchange are inseparable. And by cause of industrial progress, demand varies and multiplies to infinite extent. Manufacturers tend to, in consequence, to increase the natural utility of things and convert them all into useful value. Production increasingly extends the power of its instruments. So again, Proudhon is an accelerationist. He supports the increase of industrial production. And he bases, by virtue of these things, we tend to restore the value of things, their primitive utility, and the value of use and value exchange are in perpetual struggle. And so he goes further on this. This is where he kind of goes into fighting with Marx, but we'll just go over to it. So similar to Marx, he's relating to labor. All right. He basically says the force, which Adam Smith has glorified so eloquently, is labor. Right? Labor differs in quantity and quality with the producer. In this respect, it is like the great principles of nature and most general laws, infinitely modified by a multitude of special causes. It is labor and labor alone that produces all the elements of wealth and combines them to their last molecules according to a law of variable but certain proportionality. So again, he wants equilibrium. He wants things to be in proportion. It is labor that is the principle of life that creates wealth and proportions it. And so then he has his own theory of value. He says we can take use and exchange value, and somehow we can map them together to create a proportional, what you consider a fair value. And this is what he calls constituted value. Value conceives the proportionality of products, otherwise called constituted value, necessarily implies in an equal degree utility and finality, indivisibly and harmoniously unified. It implies utility, because without it, why would you even buy it? Why would you exchange it? And it makes element of wealth. It implies finality, because if it was not acceptable, it would be a non-value. It would be nothing. And this way, he's quite like Hayek. A thing it can't be on the market, doesn't have value. So he says, we can reconcile and create essentially, I don't know how to say it nicely, a considered value, a fair price. And then he kind of goes into his kind of theories of dialectics almost, but not really. And he says, well, look, we don't want to, we can't really, we don't, and this is where him and Marx really disagree. A value really such, like money, business paper, government annuities, shares, can be neither increased without reason nor lost in exchange. It is governed only by the natural law of the addition of special industries and the increase of products. Such a value is not the result of a compromise, blah, blah, blah. It is a product of fusion, a product entirely new and distinct from its components, just like water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen. So he's trying to get how can we reconcile value and create a value which really takes into account both the utility and the exchange value. So he wants to see utility and exchange value sort of merge. And this is where he has kind of what you consider kind of a maybe schoolboy analysis of Hegel, where he says his method is not the method of dialectics, but the method of equilibria. And he says the resolution of two antithetical ideas in a third or superior order is what the school calls synthesis. It alone gives the positive a complete concept by successive affirmation negation, so sounding a bit like Hegel, of two diametrically opposite concepts. And the antinomy of that concept, of the idea, which we first form on a priori grounds, that this antinomy contains a higher idea, which sooner or later makes an appearance. So he's got something which kind of appears to be dialectics, but not really. Oh, sorry. And then he goes into like, well, what could this be? And he actually ends up being a big supporter of gold as a natural way of measurement. I'll skip the second paragraph here, but he's talking about, well, what really makes money money? Why not? What's its utility? What's its value? Wheat, iron, there's so much stuff, but it's all viable compared to gold. And he says, why do we use gold? Because the difficulties of their production, the metallic properties, and he says, well, yeah, the intervention of a government, public authority, which fixes and authenticates it as real gold at an early date. But he says, well, look, it's not just the government arbitrarily declaring gold and silver to be money, but maybe it's not even calculated accurately. It is no longer arbitrary. And this is where there's an interesting connection to Bitcoin and the Austrian market, where Proudhon says it is no longer susceptible to depreciation. And like other values, although it may continually change, all the logic and erudition that's been expended to prove, by example, gold and silver, that value is essentially indeterminate, is arising from a false idea of the question. So he says, well, look, we can have fair exchange, which somehow takes into account utility and exchange value, and we just need a kind of natural form of money. And he kind of says, well, gold and silver are pretty good. And then I'm going to kind of finish so we can have some questions. His last text, right before he dies, he says, well, what can we have besides a nation state? And he views it as federations. And he says, well, look, I'm an anarchist. So why do I want to talk about what replaces the nation state? And Proudhon goes and says, since the phrase anarchist government involves a kind of contradiction, the thing seems impossible and the concept or idea absurd. But there's nothing to find fault with here but language. Politically, the idea of anarchy is quite rational. It's concrete as any other. What it means is that the political functions have been reduced to industrial functions, and that the social order arises from nothing but transactions and exchanges. So he's reducing the political to the economic, and therefore only then each may say then that he is the absolute ruler of himself. And he kind of critiques communism really explicitly. He says there's never been an example of perfect communism, and is scarcely likely, however far from the human race may progress in civilization, morality, and wisdom, that all traces of government and authority will vanish. And yet, while communism remains the dream of the majority of socialists, anarchy is the idea of economists who attempt to strenuously to put an end to all government institutions and to rest society on the foundations of property and free labor alone. So you can see he's really going against Marx here. And he says, well, what is it that replaces nation state? Contracts, federations. And he's thinking about the Swiss Federation, the Federation of Individuals, and the guilds, working man association, companies, the federation of these, and the villages, cities, cross-city, cross-regional federations. He wants Italy. He writes this federated principle because he's like, Italy shouldn't become a nation state. Italy's got too many different kinds of people in it, too many different languages, too many different cultures. Italy should be a federation. And he's got a very interesting view. He says, well, look, nation states don't make sense because the boundaries aren't arbitrary. For example, he supports giving Alsace and Strasbourg to Germany. He says, well, they speak German there. Why should it be part of France? France should only be those areas which have like a French culture where they speak French. and that, there's kind of, he considers a sort of natural federations and boundaries, and that his goal of the federation is to decentralize that power to the smallest possible unit, which is usually the individual and their ability to do contracts, to do labor, to buy and sell on the market. And so he says federation really just comes from Latin, from their word, which I'm not going to pronounce, foederis, which is pact, contract, agreement, alliance, which, and again, he wants equalities, the anarchist, which has reciprocal and equal commitments and rest purely on the people that sign the contract. And so again, political right, to quote Proudhon finally, requires to be buttressed by economic right, because he says otherwise it is bad anarchy. It's like capitalist crisis. So he agrees with Marx here. If the production and distribution of wealth are given over to chance, if the federal order serves merely to preset the anarchy of capital and commerce, society gets divided into two classes, the bourgeois and proletariat, and then the political order will be unstable. So again, he believes that federations, contracts, and anarchism basically keeps society in order, and otherwise you have the capitalist crisis, you have speculation, collapse of, crises, wars, or you have communism, which he says is centralization, leads to dictatorship, doesn't really have a good economic plan. And that's and then I'll just end in a second. I'll skip Max Stirner, but then Proudhon, well, Max Stirner, just to briefly go into it. Yeah, so again, very into peer-to-peer technology. So other anarchist thinkers, Max Stirner, where I did put it's usually called the ego on its own, but it's a better translation. The Eigensig and the Eigentum is the one in its property, and Marx gives Stirner a hard time, the German ideology. But you can see, from this advertisement, actually, it's interesting. Stirner had no picture of him taken. So all we have is this cartoon someone drew. Both anarchists and anarchist capitalists kind of were interested in Stirner, because Stirner basically Proudhon basically says, well, look, we have hierarchy because it's like the family. And just as we thought it's natural to have a father who's in control of the family, we think it's natural to have a king who's in control of the nation state. But he's like, this is ridiculous because that's not really natural. What would be really natural would be freedom and fair exchange and the market and so forth. And then Max Stirner says, hey, all these Max is really after the Hegelians here, his kind of ego on its own. He basically says, well, look, the issue with Hegel and the left Hegelians, and he's particularly after Feuerbach, similar to Marx. Stern doesn't critique Marx directly. He critiques Hegel, and he says, well, look, it's all idealism. He's like, look, if you're a young person, you believe in dreams and visions of a future perfect society. But he's like, let's be realistic. I believe in my own desires, my own appetites. I don't want any constraints on them. The state or collectivities or socialism would just constrain the objective spirit. These are like teenage fantasies. And Stirner claims an adult is comfortable with their own property, not just individual property, like things they own, but also their phenomenology, their experience, almost like individual phenomenology, lived experience. And this is what we as individuals should be concerned over. So that's the other kind of branch of anarchism. And then Marx versus Proudhon. Marx really goes after Proudhon. I'll just end here, where Marx basically, we're running out of time, so I want to leave 15 minutes for questions. But Marx really basically says, hey, look, the problem with Proudhon is that he takes these concepts like use value and exchange value and the market, and he's not historicizing him. Now Marx does quite the hatchet job on Proudhon, and no one reads Proudhon, too much nowadays, because after the Soviet Revolution, he became obscure and people read Marx, and but nonetheless, it should be remembered that the Paris Commune had almost no Marxists or communists involved. It was mostly Proudhonian socialists, people inspired by Proudhon. So for Marx, Proudhon was like the guy he wanted to be, the guy that was the most famous, the guy that had the most, even though Proudhon tried to avoid having followers, had the most influence intellectually on revolutionaries. And then Marx said, well, look, Proudhon, you're a friggin' idiot because you don't, sorry, I closed the window somehow. Let me do that again. Okay, well, anyways, Share screen. There we go. Sorry about that. But he basically argued by this lack of historicism. He's trying to make everything seem natural. This is incorrect, and he's ignoring. He wants society to be whole, but he's ignoring the inevitable dynamics of class structure. So that is kind of Marxist critique. In how do I get that beautiful screen? Anyways, that's Marxist critique kind of in a nutshell. And that critique has survived much longer. It's much more kind of well known than Proudhon. And it's a pretty brutal critique, but it is the critique that has survived. And I'll just finish with some words from Marx. Let's see. He says, well, let's, against constitutive value, he argues, he says, well, what Proudhon understands that labor is itself a commodity. A commodity as an object is traffic. All of Proudhon's arguments are limited to this, that labor is not bought as an immediate object consumption, but is bought as an immediate of, but Marx says it's bought as an immediate instrument of production. So he's arguing that this concept of constitutive value of fair price just doesn't exist. That there has to be antagonism. No antagonism, no progress. This is the law that civilization has followed to our days. And that, Proudhon is pretending to be a respectable bourgeois, or other people like Proudhon, like Mr. Bray. And he claims that in a purified individual exchange, freed from all elements of antagonism he finds in it, he finds the egalitarian relationship which he would like for society to adopt generally, but does not see that this egalitarian relation, this corrective ideal that he would like to apply to the world, is nothing but the reflection of the actual world. And this is totally impossible to reconstitute society on the basis of what is merely an embellished shadow of it. And we prove that the substance, far from being the transfiguration dreamt of, is the actual body of existing society. So Marx's critique is that effectively, just to summarize, that you really need dialectics, you need to have things properly historicized, and that Proudhon himself falls into a notion of idealism. Now, in defense of Proudhon, I would say that Marx doesn't really offer much of a way forward for workers. It's not clear how communism would work, and we'll talk about that next with Hayek and the socialist calculation problem in the next session. But, Proudhon has a bunch of concepts which honestly are still popular among people today, particularly crypto-anarchists and cypherpunks. The belief in free exchange, the belief in individuals maximizing their ability to do free exchange and other forms of freedom, the ability to give people credit in a collective fashion, this notion of free credit, and weirdly enough, even this belief in gold, that there has to be some kind of non-governmental money to help make exchange happen. And decentralization. The main concept that Proudhon has is that authority should be abolished and that all power should be decentralized to the smallest possible element. Okay, so that's it. That was maybe a bit much. Sorry, I'll have more time, but I want to leave some time for questions, and we'll do socialist calculation problem next session. So is there any questions, concerns? Did that make any sense? I mean, he's not a well-known reader, so I kind of had to read him for you, but so I didn't give you enough time to read it. I won't do that next time. Hopefully you'll have the reading done. Has anyone read Proudhon before, you guys? I don't think I can fit the whole socialist calculation problem in 10 minutes, so we can also end a little bit early. But if you have any comments or questions, just raise your hand. Nope. Okay.
I would like to ask
Oh,
you
there you go. So I
sort
never
of
see the hands. Okay, so just Pablo first, and then Cinza again. Go for it.
just I'm overall excited about mutualism in general as a political economy theory. and I think it could get more traction. I think it's very relevant in these times, like very useful to describe current economic realities of freelancing, multi-job situations, jumping things, relying on personal relations, local production. Like there's so many good things about it for contemporary politics. So I'm wondering if you also see a potential in it, sort of like informing more of the interesting economic experiments that might surge from the crisis of capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think a lot of mutualism was very popular. Um, again, more popular than Marx at the Paris Commune, and only really what the birth of the Soviet Union did it kind of really fall out of fashion. And you saw mutualism is weird because some socialists kind of okay, that makes sense, decentralization contracts. Some what you call libertarian communists were kind of into some elements of it. Also, a lot of capitalists are elements. There's certain elements of Proudhon which are really kind of give birth to like this notion of we really need a free and fair market without government intervention, and that's when you see a lot of the critique of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency coming from that. So I'd actually argue that um, most blockchain people kind of closeted Prudhonists. Most of them do not really want kind of big capital, monopoly capital. There's something that's gone corrupt or wrong with capitalism, so they want some sort of new phase of the market, which is or capitalism, and that mutualism is a way to think about that. And the critique of mutualism is always that, well, it's not really historical, it's very idealistic. But Proudhon correctly points out that communism and socialism doesn't really have any good economic planning. And this comes up in the next session of the socialist calculation problem. And because of that, it's not clear how it can really work without deriving into falling into authoritarianism, which is critique, which I think history has kind of has shown did happen, right? So maybe new technologies can make that less likely or impossible, maybe, who knows? But I think Proudhon has a very valid critique of socialism, which is not even really aiming at Marx, saying, look, it has a tendency to not be able to understand economics properly outside of a capitalist framing, and therefore there's no. So what Proudhon offers in contrast to socialism is a lot of kind of stuff which people might find interesting. Hey, lower prices, less government, and this sort of, you're like, wow, that would be really big in America. It's something that Americans really like, and many other people like, and it doesn't sound very much like socialism. Okay, Sinza?
Yeah. Actually, I'm kind of familiar with the word Proudhon. When I was in university, I did like an undergrad thesis on Stirner and precisely how this sort of individualist takes from the 19th century sort of have a left field influence in modern day extremisms or extremist takes. But I also remembered while reading the materials for today's session that going back to the point that I made on how secrecy plays a key role on trying to apparently challenge the ways in which profit economy thrives in welfare societies, how that secrecy also can uphold the way in which those societies might be reproducing the same thing which makes them slaves, in this case profit economy. Maybe it can be a little bit of a tricky topic, but I'll mention it anyway. And it's the fact that Proudhon, from a private perspective, now previously unveiled because of translations and yada yada and whatnot, sort of holds these arguments, these political economic arguments, from a private bias against Jewish people. And there is like, I'm gonna send like the link, I just found it. It's like there's like a letter that he writes with a friend of his called Alphonse Touzenel, in this correspondence called The Jews, Kings of the Era. And in December 26th of 1847, he states, Jews, There needs to be an article written against this race that poisons everything by sticking its nose into everything without ever mixing with any other people. Demand its expulsion from France, with the exception of those individuals married to French women. Abolish synagogues and not admit them to any employment. Demand its expulsion finally. Pursue the abolition of this religion. Is not without cause that the Christians call them deicides. The Jew is the enemy of humankind. They must be sent back to Asia or be exterminated. Hein, Vale, and others are nothing but secret spies. Rothschild, Crimea, Marx, foul, wicked, bilious, envious, bitter, etc., beings who hate us. The Jew must disappear by steel or by fusion or by expulsion. It goes way more edgy than that, but once again, it brings me to the question, do you think that cryptography can effectively have a touch on maybe offering a different economic or political subjectivity outside of profit economy, or maybe on a different state of profit economy, or it is still something withheld by the trenches of transnational capitalism, of financialism?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's two very different questions. So one is Proudhon's like really negative beliefs towards Jews, and not just towards Jews. Just let me be very clear. Proudhon was so what I said earlier is he was an artisan, he was a worker, he was from the countryside. So he also had very retrograde views towards women. I don't know if it's online. Let's see here.
Yeah, he's kind of tricky with women too.
So yeah, he's very against women having jobs. He wants them to stay in the home.
But
It's all
he's
very
brilliant.
bad.
I mean, he's brilliant. That's
Yeah, but
I'm
he's
not
a,
trying to
he's a
diminish.
brilliant writer. I think he has a lot of what I would call purple prose. He seems to be a bit outrageous sometimes. I think he's trying to provoke people. But then the problem that Proudhon had is on some level, like many, this is a Marxist critique. And Marx says, well, look, you're just a peasant. You're a small worker. You're an artisan. You want your property. You want to have fair exchanges, lower taxes. But in reality, Proudhon, like, you're not, many of your social viewpoints are very conservative, against women participating in the market. Proudhon was against universal suffrage. He didn't want everyone to vote. He was kind of against voting, really, because if everyone votes, they'll just vote a dictator in, Louis Bonaparte or Trump or whatever. And he says, well, look, he was also very anti-Semitic. This was more common at the time than it is now. But I mean, yeah, I mean, he was like, okay, I'm against interest. I'm against interest banking, and the people that do that are Jews. And he had this theory that, there shouldn't be nation states, but there were kind of natural areas of culture, right? So France should be related to the French people, Italians have different, Sicilians should be in Sicily and whatever. He wasn't really what you call a cosmopolitan. I don't think he was. I think some of his anti-Semitism actually comes late in life. And we do know he was friends with Marx and had many, many Jewish friends in the revolutionary movement. But I think Marx really hurt him. He wanted to write a response, but he never did. And I think he kind of took it out by being a bit more anti-Semitic than he should be. But nonetheless, there was a relationship. He wanted this fair banking, and you see some of those in cryptocurrency today. You still see a fair amount. You see a lot of people in the Bitcoin are what you would call neo-traditionalists. They want their wives, what's called trad wives, to stay at home. You see some early versions of that in Proudhon. So I think Proudhon has both the positive and negative aspects of a lot of the blockchain philosophy in it. You see within a lot of blockchain, maybe not Ethereum, but say like Bitcoin, you see conspiracies around Jewish banking, the Rothschilds, the
Yeah,
Fed.
exactly.
It's kind of in Proudhon as well. Proudhon's like, oh, the Rothschilds are really evil, they control the banking. So, I think so he's definitely not, like all thinkers, and we're going to, Proudhon's not the worst we're going to do. We're going to do a number of pretty terrifying people. Like all thinkers, there's elements which are interesting, which can be taken and salvaged. There's elements which are totally retrograde, which are probably thrown away. And I hope we can agree on what those are, but you never know. Some people disagree. And so I think the key point is to really like think it through a bit. And take on his viewpoints critically. Now, can you use Proudhon against profit? I mean, Proudhon's weird about profit because he wants there to be a fair exchange. He wants exchange value to kind of match use value. he doesn't believe the state should match. He believes the market, if left uninterfered by governments and by corruption and lying, would naturally give things a fair price if you got federation. So he kind of believes that there is such a thing as like this constituted value, which Marx is very much against. Marx is like, there's no fair price, there's no natural price, it's all exploitation. And you can see this through history. And Proudhon says, no, there should be a fair price for things. The market is it's hard to explain, but at the time, the market was like the alternative to the monarchy. So it was viewed, the market was viewed as a decentralized, quote unquote, natural, equilibrium based, supply should match demand, alternative. But then what the market was composed of was very unclear. Individual workers with contracts, co-ops, Proudhon, syndicates. Proudhon was really into this concept of industrial agricultural federations and all sorts of crazy stuff going on. I mean, so people weren't really sure like what the market was going to evolve into because this was all written in like the 1860s, right? So there's a lot of debate on which ways it could go. It wasn't clear if you're going to have nation states really. So I think he's an important thinker to return to despite some of his I think very, very disappointing personal views. That being said, the relationship of Proudhon to secrecy, he doesn't really say anything about it. And in relation to Proudhon, so I think Proudhon would imagine that his thinking could be used. I mean, I think if he, in a way where people make money, but it's not really what you call profit society. That's not in an exploitative way. He imagines there can be non-exploitative exchange relationships. Now, maybe he's wrong, but that's what he imagines. So he imagines that mutualism could be the basis for a decentralized society without exploitation. That's the whole goal of anarchism. And that goal is taken forward. Now, other anarchist thinkers like Kropotkin and Bakunin like disagree. They're just like, actually, that's crazy. We have to collectivize the means of production. That's what Bakunin says. Kropotkin built on top of Marx, saying we can have a version of communism which is anarchist. And then you have the other stream of anarchism from Proudhon, which leads you to Hayek and Mises, where they say, well, we need markets. We need to not worry about this private ownership of the means of production and profit. That profit's good, but we need to have more profit. And so you can see, Proudhon's very contradictory. And as a thinker, he loved contradictions, but did maybe not resolve them as well as he thought he did. Okay. I think that's it. We ran out of time. So thank you all. Just do the readings for next time. I can ask more questions. I'll do the socialist calculation bits next time. Proudhon is he's fun to read or terrible depending on your preferences. Do try to read those sections on the denationalization of money. So the denationalization of money by Hayek is a quite key text to understand the thinking behind a lot of the digital cash without a government. How is that possible? And Hayek makes, I think, the classic argument there. It's worth reading. And if any other questions, you can reach out to me. I'll be faster on my work email than my New Center email, but I'll answer both. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. I'll do less talking next time and hopefully have more discussion. So thanks so much.
Thank you.